Well, good day, and I want to welcome you to two amazing events being combined in one because our guest warrants double exposure. All right. Number one, I want to welcome everyone to There's Always a Way podcast. So whether you're watching or listening, you're part of a series of interviews with those that have made a tremendous influence and impact on my life, or they're making a tremendous impact on the world in which we live. So business, sports, faith, the faith community, the political scene. We try to cover a lot of material. So I want to first of all welcome our guest, Johnnie Moore. Johnnie, thank you for being with us. And we're actually filming on the 4th of July. So you're making a real sacrifice for us, some family time. And with your schedule, I know you have to bubble wrap family time. But Johnnie, I want our listeners, and again, I remind you and I remind everyone, because every year I invite you and you're gracious to come to speak at our SLU 201 in Washington, D.C. And the reason I always invite you to speak, and we'll have 1,500 students for those live events, is because your life illustrates, your life is a journey. And, so the two great tenets we try to teach at Student Leadership University is the future belongs to those who are prepared. And number two, what I do today determines my tomorrow. And as I look at your life, and I've been privileged to know you a long time, your life illustrates those two principles better than almost anybody I've ever met. So to me, you're just a great inspiration and example for all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of high school and university students. But we also have pastors, denominational leaders, business leaders, sports executives, those in the military, even at Central Command and other places, the Pentagon. So, and of course, senior pastor of mega churches. So we speak to a whole gamut, but again, your journey, your life is perfect. So I'm combining you with letting our students that are taking SLU 201 Reimagine be able to experience little Johnnie Moore, even though we're having to get jiggy with our program this year. But then number two, what a great voice to speak truth in, because we're really still dealing with 4 or 5 issues that are not going away and are going to be with us for a long time. So that long introduction, Johnnie, let me tee you up. Share, if you would, a few minutes about you didn't have a lot of strong influences in your life. So tell me about that.
I think when people see a young leader, they think a young leader, and I'm 37 now, right? So I'm
yes.
Still a young leader, but kind of a youngish leader, or something. But they think like you were born into privilege, or you somehow inherited this, or that's not my story. I as a kid, my parents went through an incredibly traumatic divorce, and as an adult, I view that differently now than I did as a kid. I viewed it quite judgmentally as a kid. And you'll sort of read some of that in my very, very first book. But my parents' divorce, led to a series of very, very, very difficult events in our lives. I mean, it thrust us into real poverty. We were on public assistance, and people were bringing us bread. And I know what it's like to have the lights turned off at your house. I know what it's like to have a family member who just can't deal with it anymore. To try to take their own life. I found my family member in their car after they had tried to kill themselves, and I probably saved my family member's life because I found them. But I as a traumatizing event as a child, we moved. I forgot how many times we moved before I was 12 years old. I mean, it was 20 times or something, from house to house to house to house. Like it was. It was not an easy childhood. We ended up in this one of the worst public schools in the state of South Carolina. and violence in the school every single day. I mean, people bringing weapons to school, you know, the principal of the school being knocked out cold by a student he called into discipline. I saw as a middle schooler, someone being thrown through a glass window. I mean, you know, so if things weren't bad enough because of my family, all of a sudden I end up in this war zone. And yet, you know, once a week, my youth pastor was allowed to come to the school, and I didn't have any friends. I was just in an earthquake, traumatic earthquake. And there the youth pastor was to have lunch with a few of the kids at the church, you know, and periodically he would come, and it would be like my lifeline, you know, and in God's wonderful providence, about 6 months before my parents' marriage fell apart, I would say is when I really found the Lord. And then something happened. A Sunday school teacher in our church began to teach us how to study the Bible. And from 9 to 9:30 every single night as a kid, in a kid's way, I just open up the Bible, I'd read a Bible verse, and I'd write my little notes, in which I have that notepad, you know, as a kid. And it's sometimes not discernible. It's you know, it's childlike thoughts. But in that notepad, one day I read about Solomon as a young kid asking for wisdom. I read that verse and I wrote in the notepad, God, if you could give wisdom to Solomon, will you give wisdom to me? And as a kid, almost the same age as Solomon at the time. And I really think that prayer and that series of events anchored my life into God's plan for my life that transcended those storms. And it's amazing that when my parents, when their marriage fell apart, I became the diplomat, you know, because I ended up in a relationship with both my mom and my dad when they couldn't talk to each other. And I would do like shuttle diplomacy. I'd get on the phone and talk to dad, and then I'd talk to mom and talk to dad and talk to mom. I'm like 13, 14 years old, you know, and here I am as an adult. And, you know, a lot of my human rights work and religious freedom work around the world involves diplomacy, being a peacemaker between groups of people that can't talk to each other. And so you see, like, what the enemy meant for evil, God used for good. And I could go on and on, but I'll leave it there.
I agree 100%, Johnny. I've been privileged to be with you in a lot of those kind of situations. I know how effective you are. I remember telling somebody at one of those gatherings that just made a comment, you know, what credentials do you have for being here? And I said, man, I don't have any. So I went through 6 broken homes and 6 foster homes, and I spent my life trying to put Band-Aids on situations to get things to stick together the best I could just to survive. And I said, I kind of view what's going on around the world in the same light. Somebody better have a big box of Band-Aids and care enough to try to get these 2 groups together. But I agree with you. I think our childhoods and our backgrounds it certainly gave us the ability to empathize and to realize there's 2 sides to every situation.
Before you move on, let me just say, like, education is essential in the world that we're living in. Essential. It is also entirely inadequate, because the problem with education is education can give you a piece of paper that convinces you that you know everything. And that is a very, very dangerous thing. You have to have both. You have to know history, and you have to know all of these things. You have to have education, but you have to have more than education. And those are the types of things you can only get through lived experience.
That's a great point.
Experience you're forced to live through, or those that you choose to live through.
That's a great insight, Johnny. One of my all-time favorite quotes, one of them, is that education shows me where I can go to find the answer. That's all education. It's not an end. You know, whenever students say, well, how much education do I need? Do I need a bachelor's, a master's? Does it matter how many majors I have? You know, those kind of, and those are honest, legitimate questions for students. But what's really helped me is that whether I'm reading a book or whether it's a podcast or an Audible book I'm listening to, being dyslexic so bad, and ADDD Audible books saved my life. But education has taught me, I don't know all the answers, but I'm almost to the place where I know where to go find the answers. And I came to that definition long before I started doing the Google, which has changed everything. You get shorthand, but that's all education is. It helps you know where to go, or it lets you know that all of us are smarter than any one of us. And I sometimes wish leaders would remember that, because sometimes we feel, well, I'm the smartest guy in the room. And I have found that all of us together are smarter than any one of us. Now, Johnnie, you left Liberty University. Everybody was shocked when you left Liberty University, and probably you were too. But you'd been given an opportunity, knowing how you felt about preparing students for the future, but the cultural issues going on, an opportunity to move to Hollywood, an opportunity to be with one of the most successful film producers, TV producers around. That was a great opportunity, and I know you probably felt like it's too good to pass up.
Yeah, I mean, I was recruited to Hollywood. I never had any ambition to be in the entertainment industry. I never imagined I would be in the entertainment industry. But what led me to be recruited there is I was serving my passion, even when I was at Liberty. One of my passions, which is to help persecuted Christians around the world, to be a voice for human rights and religious freedom, and that took me to Jordan. And through a series of events too long to describe now, I ended up in a meeting in Jordan that was convened by the king and about 50 people. And those 50 people included several evangelicals, of course, and then 3 Catholic cardinals, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, I think 5 of the 7 Orthodox patriarchs, all of the significant Anglican leaders throughout the Middle East. And it was all about the threats to the Christian community in the Middle East. And among those that were in the crowd were Mark Burnett and Roma Downey. So they were part of the 50. And I said, you know what, you ought to come speak at Liberty University sometime. We have this chapel, there are 10,000 students in it, happens 3 times a week. They were producing more and more content for Christian audiences, like the Bible miniseries and the Son of God movie and all these things. I'm just doing my job. I'm showing Mark around campus, and Mark looks at me and he says, I think we're going to do something together one day. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. And I didn't think much of it. I mean, I put them, back at the airports, and off they went. And I went on with my life. And then out of the blue one day, I get a cold call. It's, my phone in the office rings. It's a Hollywood assistant. It says, Johnnie Moore had Mark Burnett for you. Are you available? I said, oh, sure. And that's where Mark Burnett invited me on the fly, to come to Hollywood to become his chief of staff and vice president of faith content for his company, which at the time was called 1-3 Media. It was acquired by MGM while I was there. And that's how I ended up in Hollywood. And to, in a job like being chief of staff to Mark Burnett is a big job in Hollywood. Like it just doesn't happen, except, clearly this was something God was doing. And I can tell you, and this may sound strange to people, but leaving Lynchburg, Virginia and Liberty University to go to Hollywood was a huge step outside of my comfort zone. Okay, it was outside of my comfort zone. It wasn't in my comfort zone, but it was an amazing experience.
Well, by the way, that little company you started at the time has morphed into a very significant enterprise. Tell us a little bit about Kairos.
Yeah, it's a communications firm. What really sets us apart is that we're strategists. The way we think about our the messages and the missions of the organizations that we work with is different. And it's not our job to be those organizations or to change their messages and missions. It's our job to just help them reach more people with those messages and to fulfill their mission more effectively. That's what we do. And it's thank God. I mean, it's become quite successful. And it's interesting. Some people think like because I'm a business person now, that I somehow left the ministry, and it's the exact opposite. I mean, now the beautiful thing is like my ministry is almost entirely voluntary. And it's an amazing blessing. Like I'm every bit, the pastor that I was, even though I don't have a congregation. It's just different, it's like very, very traditionally Christian, right? I mean, the Apostle Paul was a tent maker. He went from city to city making tents. That's how you wonder why he was so effective, why he was able to reach so many people and to plant so many churches. It's because he wasn't just preaching in the synagogues on the weekends. He was working. He had calluses on his hands. He met the merchants in the markets that he bought his supplies from. He had dinner with the clients that he was selling his tents to. He was immersed inside of society. He didn't withdraw Christianity from culture. He lived as a Christian within culture. And I've sometimes said, like, God forbid that if God's call for you is to be a preacher and pastor a church, that you dare stoop so low as to become a business person. But God forbid, if God's call for you is to be a business person, that you dare stoop so low, as to become a pastor of a church. And God forbid, if God's call is for you to do all of it, that you don't refuse him in that call. And for me, I mean, it's, our problem in the world isn't that we have too few pastors. Sometimes we have too few missionaries in certain places. But our problem in the world isn't that we have too few pastors sometimes. It's that we have too few Christians who are willing to be a Christian with their gifts and talents where where God assigns them to be. And sometimes, by the way, when it comes to our missionary activity around the world, it's one thing if you're going to an unreached place. We need Green Beret missionaries in unreached places. But you know what we need in reached places, or places where there are opportunities? We need to be like Paul. We need to go be doctors and lawyers and nurses and accountants and financial managers and teachers. We just need to be Christians in culture, and then we won't probably look with such, absurdity at the culture around us and wonder where the Christian witness is. It's because we left. That's why. And we need to go back inside of it. And if they won't let us inside of it, we need to create our own.
Speaking of being willing to go wherever God calls you to go, if my memory's right, you were working on a much anticipated, significant Christian film when you heard about a situation going on a couple hours away at what is, many believe, literally the birthplace of Christianity. And yet there was a slaughter going on. There were some things happening. And tell us about that moment where the light came on, that the Lord spoke, Damascus Road, call it what you want. It was a game changer, I believe, one of several in your life, where because you were obedient, some amazing doors have swung open.
We were working on, Mark and Roma were producing, and I was, doing my part on a television series for NBC called AD. And AD was the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is a lot about persecuted Christians. And it was being filmed in Morocco. And every day, it was an amazing experience. I mean, being in Hollywood and being in London, which is where the writing team was, and the production team, and then Morocco, where the set was. We're literally reading the book of Acts every single day, and the scripts would come, and it was an amazing experience to see the Bible in the height of Hollywood, NBC, primetime, all coming together. It was an amazing experience. And yet simultaneously, in Iraq and Syria, we were seeing the worst Christian persecution that we had seen in generations, maybe centuries, and what I eventually came to call a once in a 1,000-year event, because Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. Okay, It wasn't founded in Kansas. It came from the Middle East. And I remember one night I received an email late at night. And the email was from a Syrian pastor. And the Syrian pastor was describing the bombs that were hitting his home. And he was doing it in real time. Literally on his cell phone, the lights were out and he's typing. I hear the blast all around me. I'm not sure what the best thing to do is, to try to go to sleep so that if the bombs hit, then I'm asleep, or try to run out of the house. I mean, it's like reading the Diary of Anne Frank. He's like writing this on his cell phone. And then he writes, just now, it finally hit us, shaking this big building that I'm living in. And I was just reading this email that came in from a random Syrian pastor sent to me. As I'm working on this story about the persecution of Christians from 2,000 years earlier, it was late at night. My wife and kids were asleep. My 1-month-old daughter was asleep. And that's where I knew, like, I just had to go and see it for myself. And so within weeks, I had gotten on a commercial airline, because you still could. I flew into Erbil in northern Iraq when ISIS was at its absolute height. They were 20 kilometers from the Baghdad airport on the days that I was there. They were not far from Erbil. There were thousands of Christians that had recently been run out of their historic towns. And I just heard their stories. And story after story after story of people being sold on modern slave markets, and Christian houses being marked, and forcible conversions. And I remember sitting with this nun late at night because she had worked all day long. And she said, Johnny, I love America. It's a beautiful country, wonderful people. She said, I have a PhD from an American university. She said, you take care of your pets so well. So why are you silent in the face of our genocide? And it was one of the most impactful conversations of my life. And I decided at that point, I couldn't be silent. I had to tell the story of these people, and I had to help them. And so we did. I wrote a book called Defying ISIS, Preserving Christianity in the place of its birth. And then Mark and Roma used the full power of their Hollywood platform and started a number of initiatives that I was able to run that eventually raised over $20 million to help Christians in northern Iraq. It was at that time that we had a vision of what could happen if the United States government intervened, and it wasn't something that was possible then. But in this administration, we've seen that plan happen, where the United States government has sent $300 million into northern Iraq to help the Christian and Yazidi communities. But one of the lessons I took away from going to northern Iraq is you just have to act if you care. You have to do something, even if it's wrong. You have to do something, and it's amazing what will happen if you just act. And I also learned that the most important thing to do in these crises around the world, whether it's in our country or in other countries, and there's no comparison between our country and these other circumstances. I'm not drawing that comparison, but when there are crises of whatever type, the most important thing that you can do is go sit down and listen to the victims, and then be their voice. That's the most important thing that you can do. And that makes all the difference all around the world. In fact, just before COVID-19, a rabbi friend of mine from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, Rabbi Abraham Cooper, and I, we went to Nigeria 2 weeks before the world shut down because of COVID. And what did we do? Yeah, we met with the leaders of the country, and we met with the politicians. We did all that stuff. We met with all the religious leaders. But most importantly, we spent 2 full days sitting down listening to dozens and dozens of victims of terrorism and of what I call genocide against the Christian community in parts of that country. Unfortunately, it's now, in my opinion, reached the level that you can say it's genocidal activity. And we just listened to them. tell their own terrifying stories.
You know, that event where you went and went to northern Iraq, led to you doing a very bold action. And, you know, most people would lead with that and want to tell everybody, this is what I did. I've always found I kind of have to pry it out of you. I have to get you under the influence of a couple coffees before you will spill the beans. But I happen to be privileged to be with you the night in Los Angeles when I watched you be honored in a world that I knew nothing about. I knew about Simon Wiesenthal, obviously the great defender, if you will, and pursuer of truth and righteousness and justice, and the Simon Wiesenthal Center's known globally. But you got an award. I think it was one of 4 that night. And all I know is there were folks that had a part in the program that I never would have would showed how shallow my life had been. But Barbara Streisand and 3 or 4 others that are not known as strong supporters of most of the things, were there when you received this honor. And so tell our viewers and listeners about how a young man trying to do his job well, heard about something that you knew from your biblical background, your experience, was breaking the heart of God. You go to check on the Christians that are there, and then you hear of another group being greatly persecuted. Tell that story, if you would.
Well, I mean, first of all, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, as you said, I mean, and I know the story of Simon Wiesenthal. Our students ought to be taught the story of Simon Wiesenthal. He was an amazing, amazing man. I heard of the Simon Wiesenthal Center because they were the first organization to say that genocide was being committed against Christians and Yazidis in northern Iraq. No Christian organization had said it. It was a Jewish organization that was the first one to say it. And I ended up getting in touch with them, and they heard about what I was doing in the book that I'd written, and the people that we had evacuated and all this stuff. Which I never take any credit for because there were dozens and dozens and dozens of people involved. It was the only thing I could take credit for is I was one of those involved, and sometimes the mouthpiece of the rest of them. And I still don't think I deserve it. But and in fact, once again, when the rabbis called me to tell me that they and the board had decided to give me this award, I turned them down. And I turned them down because I didn't believe I could take credit for it because of all the others that were involved, and I was just one. But the rabbis quoted something from the Talmud, which says, like, those who feel like they don't deserve an honor are those who deserve an honor. And so they refused to let me not take it. And so they
refused your refusal.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I was not allowed to refuse. And it was this crazy moment because there I was, having gone to Hollywood as a chief of staff. So it was a huge, big, gigantic job. But I wasn't a head of a studio or any of that. It was just a job. It wasn't. It was a big job, but not those types of jobs.
Right.
And yet, in that audience that evening, was the chair or the vice chair of virtually every major Hollywood studio or production house, anything you've ever heard of. They were all there, countless celebrities in that audience. And yet, in this strange moment, I was standing being honored in front of all these people. And the only reason why is just because I acted when a lot of people didn't act. And what I said that evening was that my vision is that one day that it will be so common for people to act when there's an issue around the world, that these awards will become totally irrelevant because there's no one deserving of honor anymore because everyone deserves the honor.